So this is my statement of self, recording this on the 1st of the 1st, 2019. I began playing Dungeons & Dragons when I was 9, courtesy of my big brother. From there on out, I was sold, and I'm here still 25 years later. I've played every edition since first, and I've gotten something different from each one. Here I'm just going to basically run through an overview of my experience on the whole. First edition gave me an idea of how collaborative storytelling worked. I get the feeling that it was still finding its way as a hobby back then. I'm actually a little bit young to have connected with D&D during first edition's heyday, but I had the opportunity to play quite a bit of it at high school with a friend's father who had first edition rulebooks. I actually connected with D&D during the heyday of second edition. They were the first rulebooks I owned, and for me that was when things got really good. I wrote my first dungeons to actually run as a DM in second ed, and though I never got to run more than one or two of them, it definitely gave me the bug. And since then, since about the age of maybe 14, 15, I've considered myself more of a DM than a player. So third ed was a bit of a non-event for me for two main reasons. First, I hit university, began making friends outside the hobby. Study took over, I was poor, and didn't really have time for it, basically. Second reason, I started playing other systems with the little bit of time that I did have at that point. I did actually play one or two games of third edition, which I really enjoyed, but I still haven't had that much experience with it compared to virtually every other edition. Both of those other systems I mentioned and the whole not much of third ed thing are significant things that I'm going to talk about later on. So basically I started playing World of Darkness quite a bit, and there was Heiengai Okai a little bit in there as well. These are other role-playing systems I hadn't engaged with. I'll talk about other systems and stuff, as well as my kind of how they've influenced how I play D&D at a later date. And I'll also talk about third edition a little bit more in another one of these screencasts, podcasts, whatever you want to call them. So moving on, I reconnected with 4th edition as a player. I know that 4th edition is often maligned in the community, but in all honesty, I had a pretty good time with it. I knew what I was there for. The game delivered on it. I began to consciously absorb information, kind of meta-information about game design, and draw connections between like influences and practices and how systems were designed around the time that 4th ed came out. So for the record, I went to university originally to study journalism first, but I changed to literature and film after a year. Basically, I've always had a great love of language. D&D helped me foster that. I originally wanted to be a TV writer and a journalist, and I ended up wanting to design games. But I've always had more of a sort of an intellectual kind of bent. I hate using that term, but I've never gone to uni. I've never had any formal education in game design, so to speak, but I've had a lot of time to research it in my off time, I guess. Anyway, so around the time I began playing 4th ed, I actually went back to uni and I did a master's in library and information science with the intention of working in a library because there were books in there. I did a couple of projects on gaming in libraries during this time, with a focus on tabletop role-playing games. This is another thing that I could talk about later. because there was a lot of sort of miscommunication about what gaming in libraries sort of meant. That's for another time, though. Something else for another time. I was basically digesting all of this technical information on how things had been set up and what it meant to be gameful and all of this kind of thing, and how successful games were made. This was another big thing with Dungeons and Dragons, because it had a pedigree and had lasted for quite a few years at that point. So I saw a lot of good design in 4th Ed. Now, look, I'm not saying that it was the perfect system, but I don't think that it deserves the reputation that it has. This I'm going to go into. I'll probably end up discussing each edition in its own video, but for the purposes of this, that's what I have to think about 4th Ed in a short version. So then I came into contact with 5th Ed by way of D&D Next. I was basically there at day 1 for D&D 5th. I'd reconnected at that point properly, and life had settled down to a point where I could be there for the inception of a new edition. In my opinion, 5th edition D&D is their strongest offering yet. It's well designed. It strikes a good balance between role-playing and combat, and that's kind of the very condensed version. So these days I'm currently running 4 games of Dungeons and Dragons a week. It's paying my rent. And then I run other systems if and when I can. I play in 1 game at the moment when I get the Steam up. Those other systems that I mentioned, they definitely have an influence on how I run D&D. That, as I've stated before, will probably take the form of another video later on. I'm also finding myself at this point getting involved in the community in a number of ways, engaging in social media, or engaging with it on social media, dipping my toes into the murky depths of Adventurers League from time to time. And these videos, these audio recordings, are sort of another aspect of that engagement as well, even though these are mostly intended to be kind of for my own records, so I have a kind of quick reference in a way, and I can get my thoughts down as they come out, as is probably being ably demonstrated by my meandering all over the shop. But anyway, so at the moment, as this stands, my games are all face-to-face. I run a semi-digital setup. I use iPads. I use the cloud in-game, but most of my stuff, most of the design that I do is handwritten. I still use pen and ink. I don't use Roll20 or anything like that. And I cleave to, the old ways, the old, do it by hand, unless it sort of speeds stuff up. I find the cloud and stuff useful for collaboration and whatnot. But, I don't have a D&D Beyond account or anything. There's reasons for that. I feel like I'm sort of basically seeding a whole bunch of videos throughout this one, to be honest, because all of this bears talking about later, but just to describe my setup now, that's how it works. D&D Beyond, it's not that I dislike it, it's mainly financial at the moment. I can talk about that later. I'm going to try and talk more about my own take on various aspects of the game itself at this point. Not only, there are a couple of differences that I think are relevant as well just by way of introduction. I run D&D for money, which isn't something that often seems to happen. and it's been interesting. I've been doing it for about a year now. And I also grew up in rural Australia, which I feel like it gives me a bit of a different perspective on what you would take as the normal role players take on things, if that makes sense. I seem to have a bit of a different way of looking at it, a bit of a different take on how games are built and like even things like the culture and whatnot. This is another thing. My undergrad degree is in film literature and cultural studies. I've always been fascinated by how people interact, what people produce. So all of this is kind of like, and then I pack all of this into the game and off we go, and it seems to be going okay, but I thought I'd do this to try and kind of get my thoughts down on paper or in the air, so to speak. So, I find myself fascinated with the cultural impact of RPGs, but I also have some really big problems with various aspects of that culture. There's another video, and just to finish this off, going forward from here, there's 3 broad categories that I'm going to try and sort of cover, or 3 bins that I'm going to drop these videos into. There's behind the screen stuff, so the art of DMing, rules, table talk, stuff like that. Basically the technicalities of running a game and things like that. Then there's the cultural impact, so this is kind of taking a step back from the screen and the table and investigating nerd culture, what's happening with RPGs, things like that. I am by no means, I think one of my major kind of stumbling blocks has been that I'm not actually interested in a lot of nerd culture. I read deeply, but not amazingly widely. At least that's the way I think of it. I still read more widely than a lot of guys that I meet. I'm not interested in comics or anything like that, to be honest. I've never really interfaced with them. Role-playing games are kind of where I'm at, because for me it's a creative outlet. I'm a writer first and a gamer second. I sort of, that's the way I feel about it anyway. And then the third thing that I want to talk about is hardcore world building. So these are like the in-game stories, the vignettes, stuff from a character's point of view that are like in-character kind of voice acty kind of things. The actual product of creation, of the creative process, I guess, is the way I think about it. So those are the 3 sorts of things that I'd like to sort of drop in here. And I hope that you will enjoy them. So I'm also not entirely sure if these are all the sorts of topics that I want to cover, but at least those 3 give me a start. I can add or subtract as I go. Who knows? I might end up with a whole other account dedicated just to in-character D&D readings. So thank you for listening. I'll get into... That basically gives you an overview of where I'm at, who I am, and I'm going to get to kind of the real meat of all of this in subsequent videos. Thank you.